Hey guys, okay, here is another derivative rule for you. So it's called the quotient rule. So this is still in A3, and we've just been learning a bunch of rules for finding derivatives of different functions, and now we're on quotient rule. So quotient rule is when you have two functions in a fraction together, like this. So like, let's say you had, I'll just give you an example. Say you had that f of x is equal to like x plus 1 over x squared minus 1. So you'll be able to use the quotient rule to find the derivative of those functions. Oftentimes with the product rule and the quotient rule, you're going to need the chain rule. So we got to learn that. That's our last rule, which we need to learn really fast because it's often used in combination with product rule and quotient rule. Okay, so we're actually going to take the product rule and we're going to use that to help us differentiate or help us figure out the quotient rule. Okay, so let's start with this equation. So q of x is equal to f of x divided by g of x. And g of x can't be 0. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the product rule to make a new rule called the quotient rule. Okay, so I'm just going to start by multiplying both sides of this equation by g of x. It's going to become q of x times g of x equals f of x over g of x times g of x. Okay, so I multiplied both sides of that by g of x, and that just made these two go away because when you divide them, you'll get 1. Okay, next step, I'm going to differentiate both sides of my equation now. So I'm actually going to find the derivative f prime of x, and if I wanted to find the derivative of this side, I'm going to need the product rule. So I know the product rule is I take the derivative of the first times the second plus the derivative of the second, or the derivative of the second one times the first one. Okay, so I just used product rule that we learned last week. Okay, next step, I'm going to bring this to the other side because eventually I want to get q prime x alone. Okay, so I'm going to leave this q prime of x times g of x on the left, and on the right I'm going to have f prime of x minus g prime of x times q of x. Okay, next step, what should I do next? Next, I don't want a q in the right side of my equation here. So I'm actually going to, since I know q of x is actually equal to f of x over g of x, I'm going to sub that in for q of x. So q prime x times g of x equals f prime of x minus g prime of x. And instead of q of x, I'm popping in f of x times g of x. And now I'm just going to get a common denominator for these two fractions. That's over 1. So q prime x times g of x is equal to, so I'm going to multiply the first term by g of x to get a common denominator. So f prime x g of x over g of x. And this one's already good, so g prime of x times f of x over g of x. And now I'll just combine my fractions. So I got f prime x times g of x minus g prime of x times f of x, and the whole thing is over g of x. And now the only thing I need to get rid of is this g of x, so I'm going to divide both sides by g of x. And when I divide this side, it just adds another g of x to the denominator. So I've got q prime x equals f prime of x times g of x minus g prime of x times f of x. So it actually looks like the product rule divided by g of x squared. So I have 2 g of x's. So this right here, we just derived the quotient rule from the product rule. So this guy right here is called the quotient rule. So that is the quotient rule. And it can be used when you've got two functions divided by each other. So for example, it's hard to use until you know the chain rule. But let's see, can we try it? Yeah, okay. Well, let's do, sorry, delay. Okay, so let's say our function, let's say q of x is equal to 4x cubed minus 7 divided by 2x squared minus 3. So to find the derivative of that function, we can use the quotient rule. So q prime x equals, so according to the quotient rule, first we find the derivative of f of x, which is the numerator. So the derivative of 4x cubed minus 7 is 12x squared. And then we simply write g of x, which is our denominator. So 2x squared minus 3. Subtract. Okay, next we have to find the derivative of the bottom function, which is 4x. And then we just write the numerator, so 4x cubed minus 7. And then the whole thing is divided by g of x squared, so the denominator squared. So 2x squared minus 3 squared. And then you should probably simplify that because it doesn't look that good. So if I simplified that, I would get 24x to the power of 4 minus 36x squared minus, so 4 times 4 is 16x to the power of 4. And then 4x times negative 7 is negative 28x, which is going to turn into a positive because of this negative. So negative 28x, so positive 28x. And then the whole thing is divided by, I'm just going to leave 2x squared minus 3 squared together. And then just collecting like terms, 24 minus 16 would be 8x to the power of 4 minus 36x squared plus 28x over 2x squared minus 3 squared. So that would be the derivative. So that's your original function. And q prime of x is the derivative using the quotient rule. Yeah. So yeah, this guy right here, quotient rule. I'll show you in another video how to use the product rule and never need the quotient rule. But if you need the quotient rule, if you like it, there it is. And it can help you find the derivative when you have a fraction like this, like a function divided by a function. Awesome.